Alright, so now we're going to talk about ecology. Ecology is basically the branch of biology that deals with relationships of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. It's going to deal with interactions between living organisms, like how they talk to each other or deal with each other in the environment. So one of the biggest factors of interactions is how these things get energy and how they work with each other to get energy. So we're going to look at something that you probably know a little bit about, and this is going to be food chains. So let's do a food chain real quick. Here's some grass, here's a beetle, here's a little bird, and then finally a snake. There's a basic food chain. At the front of the food chain, you're always going to start with a producer. So remember, you can get energy from two different things: sun, photosynthesis, or eating an organism like humans do. So the sun is kind of at the start of all the food chains, but it's not an organism, so you're not going to actually have a sun drawn and then an arrow. Even though there's transferring of energy from sun to grass, you don't really have it in the food chain. So the next step up from a food chain would be a food web. So a chain is one straight line. It's like this goes to this, goes to this, goes to this, goes to this. A food web is where you actually get a little bit of entanglement, and it's a little bit more realistic. So if you're looking at an environment where you have all these creatures that don't eat one specific thing, for example, let's look at our plant. Say our plant has blades of grass and some berries. The bird can also eat the berries on the plant, so there's an arrow from there to there. You might also have some random bird that's like a hawk or whatever. This thing could eat the beetles, and it might actually also eat the snake. So now you have arrows of energy going from these, almost looking like they're going backwards. So it's no longer a chain. You've basically taken a straight line that's a chain, and you've started to intertwine many chains, and it creates a web. So we're basically trying to determine levels and tiers for these organisms as we go through our food chain. Remember, we can always put any living thing into this. You wouldn't have a virus, but, since they're not living, that makes sense. So the trophic level pyramid is very similar to the one you learned when you were young about food and food group. The bigger the spacing on each level, basically the bottom, you're going to have more organisms there. The higher up you go, you have less organisms. The bottom level is going to be all of our producers because they get the energy from the sun. That's how we have to start off. If something eats a producer, like if it eats the bush, if it eats the tree, if it eats some kind of bacteria that gets energy from the sun, that is going to be the primary consumer. It's going to be the first consumer in the food chain, the first organism to actually consume and eat something for energy. Going up one level, if something eats that primary consumer, so for example, we got grass as our producer, primary consumer is our beetle, the next step would be what eats that beetle. That's going to be our secondary consumer. It's the second thing to actually consume and eat something. If you eat a secondary consumer, you're a tertiary consumer. That just means the third consumer, basically. And finally, if you eat a tertiary consumer, you're a quaternary consumer, fourth consumer. This is usually going to be the top of the food chain. This is going to be some kind of top predator, large animal, whatever it is. You also have a couple things that don't really fit into the pyramid, but they are part of the environment. So you have scavengers, which are going to tag a little bit of energy from each level. They're going to kind of recycle stuff. You might have a dead tertiary or a dead primary that they scavenge off of. So it's not like they only eat one thing. They eat a little bit of all. Decomposers are actually going to take the dead organic matter from any level that doesn't get picked apart by scavengers, and it's going to decompose it and break it back down into the producer level, basically back into the soil so that plants can have all the nutrients that were in those organisms, and they recycle them back. Now, decomposers get kind of confusing because a lot of times we'll think of a fungus, like a mushroom, like a decomposer. But if there's something that's on a living creature or a living tree, for example, we probably wouldn't call it a decomposer because it's not breaking down dead organic matter. It's kind of feeding off of the tree. So it's getting energy from the tree. So the energy from the tree is going to that fungus. The word decomposer is largely reserved for stuff that breaks down already dead organic matter. So not only do you have kind of tiers in this pyramid, but you have steps. You actually have levels. So it's like you're going up stairs or something. Each step has a number. First level is producers, second level, third level, fourth level, and fifth level. So don't get confused about how people classify the levels. If they say what organism is at the fourth trophic level, that's actually talking about the tertiary consumer. It gets kind of annoying because you basically have a word in front of consumer that means a number. So secondary consumer, I'd be like, what trophic level is the secondary consumer at? And if you said 2, that'd be wrong, because the second step is the primary consumer. You basically got off by 1 because the word producer doesn't have this number word in front of it. So if they ask for trophic level, you're giving 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If they ask for consumer, you're going to say what level of consumer. So you have tons and tons of producers. You're always going to have a huge amount of producers, way more than anything else, because of the size of the level, and just based on logic, you have more plants than you do birds. The reason for this is because you have the sun. Remember, it's involved in the very beginning. It's going to give energy straight to these producers. The things that perform photosynthesis are actually going to take the energy from the sun. So for example, say it gets 5,000 joules from the sun. We have a primary consumer, beetle, and he's going to munch on the leaf or the blade of grass or whatever it is from our producer. It's not going to get straight 5,000 joules from that producer. So instead, it's only going to get a small percentage. Heat, different processes, all these things are going to lose some of that energy initially gained from the sun. So we're going to use a rule called the 10% rule. It's going to take 10% of the energy and pass it on to the next level. So if you're not a math genius, that's okay. All you have to do is bump the decimal place 1 to the left. That 5,000 joules now becomes 500 joules for the primary consumer. Now the problem is that 500 joules is not going to be enough to sustain the beetle. So it has to eat more than 1 blade of grass. Then we go up to our bird. It's going to do the same thing. We bump that decimal place 1 over to the left, and you get 50 joules at the secondary consumer. So that can't support the bird. It's not enough to actually sustain the bird nutritionally, so it's going to have to eat more bugs. We go up to the tertiary consumer with 5 joules for a snake. That is not a lot from the initial energy. So it's going to have to eat a lot of birds in order to get to its total energy that it needs. The higher you go up, the more and more you have to eat. Finally, we'll do a quaternary consumer. Let's say it's some giant angry hawk, whatever. Caw, there it is. He's only going to get 0.5 joules from our original 5,000. This is why you have less hawks than you do beetles, or less hawks than you do blades of grass or bushes or whatever producer it is. You have to eat more and more of the thing below you the higher you go up. Since it's a pyramid, you actually have less population of those animals the higher you go up as well. This is why stuff that's high up in the food chain seems to be a little bit rare. It's rarer to see a bald eagle, for example, or a tiger than it is a sparrow or a worm. You always encounter plants and grass and bugs because they're lower on the food chain. It takes hundreds and even thousands of those to support populations of something directly above it. Now, humans are the exception, so when you're thinking about ecology, don't think about humans, because the humans have evolved to a point where they almost transcend ecology and they transcend the laws of nature, because we can work around with our brains, so it's a little bit different. So if we, for example, ran out of resources at a certain spot, instead of the population balancing out, like, okay, all these humans die, and then we eventually get a balance where it's like this many humans, and this many birds, and this many bugs, we will actually move to a new place to get more resources, or in the case of what we do now, like trade, we can actually have people bring resources from another region to us. So our population is probably too large for this planet if you actually kind of add up the amount of resources, especially in specific regions like India. It is way too dense. Like if you look at this population chart, it's stupid. There's like 1 billion people in just this area alone. In nature, that would have balanced out long ago. There's no reason for that many people to be in one area in nature. Humans have found the workaround with our brains. Instead of nature kind of manipulating our population and changing us, we have figured out how to actually change nature to suit our needs and kind of to be able to do whatever we want. So let's put it all together. So here's a food web. I've written out the words to save you from looking at my terrible tiny drawings of all these creatures. So we're going to trace all the energy from the food chains that have been combined in the food web. Now, remember, these are not all encompassing. That basically means that it's not going to have every little scenario. If I give you a scenario and I want you to draw a food chain or a food web, just do what I tell you. Don't assume, like for example on ours, yeah, a mosquito could be nibbling on a rabbit. Don't assume it unless I actually said it, especially in like a problem that you would see on a biology test. So we don't have a straight line from the pyramid anymore. We don't have this. This is just our straight food chain going from producer all the way to quaternary. But we still have to categorize these organisms into the same tiers. Even though they're not a straight line, we still have to have primary consumers, secondary consumers, producers, tertiary, quaternary. We still have to have all that. So you have to identify it. So you could actually do a line for a producer, jagged line for secondary, square for tertiary, whatever you want. But Ideally, you can use different colors rather than just using one pen, one pencil, but you got to work with what you got. So let's say we have grass, that's our producer. We're going to underline it in green. Use blue as our primary, red for secondary, purple for tertiary, and brown for quaternary. So we'll use those exact same colors for this. So anything that has an arrow pointing away from a green is going to be a blue. The arrow is always going to point the direction of the energy transfer. So you're going to have it going from grass away, but you're not going to have it going back towards the grass. So anything where a green has an arrow going away, that's the blue. So we got our grass as our green, we got 2 arrows pointing away from it. That means bug and rabbit are both primary consumers. So now we're going to do the same thing for secondary. Any arrows pointing away from a blue is a red. That's small bird, snake, hawk, and human. So now you can kind of see where it is going to have problems. You actually have reds all over the place, and it's not a simple chain like we've been working with. So it almost looks like small bird, which is a secondary, gets eaten by snake, which is a secondary, but snake also gets eaten by a secondary. So that doesn't make sense, but don't worry, we're not done. Anything that eats a red is going to be purple, which is our tertiary consumer. So what eats our small bird? Snake. So we're going to put a second underline color on the snake. Snake is red, so we're going to put a second purple line under the hawk. Human is red, so that means mosquito gets its first line as purple, which is tertiary consumer. Finally, you look at all the purples. Does anything in here eat a purple? There's one. The snake gets eaten by the hawk. So we are going to underline hawk with the brown quaternary line. Nothing eats the mosquito, so it just stays purple. Now, this can get infinitely more complicated, but remember, we could have taken mosquito and put it back, say, oh, okay, well, it does feed on the hawk. We're only writing down stuff specifically stated in the scenario. This could get way, way complicated. You could have colors all over the place, and you could have multiple producers, but this is basically how you're going to be able to decipher your food webs. It's going to be fairly straightforward. It's a combination of like maybe 2 or 3 food chains. There's a food web. Remember, you can get up past quaternary. There's not really a cool name for it. It's just like, this is the 5th level consumer. Underline it with orange. This is a 6th level consumer, 7th level. So you can get really, really complicated, but I've never seen anything at the high school level that really went past quaternary. If you have the chance to use colors, use the colors, please, because I can do this pretty easily. Like, this isn't super hard for me, but it's very easy for me to mess up a line, and then after that, everything's wrong. So if I put the blue line or the red line in the wrong place, everything after that is wrong. Even when I'm building a key for my students, we have a project where we have a huge food web and they got to do this for it. It's very easy for me to get off, and then I have to double check because, again, I know the concepts, but it's just simple human error. I underlined the wrong thing. I went too fast. It happens. Use your colors so you can decipher this thing out, and there you go.